It's good to see everyone this morning. It's always a beautiful day when we come together to worship and praise together, and when it's so beautiful and cool outside, it's just an extra bonus, isn't it? But it's good to see you here. I want to start off our lesson this morning with a question. What is your most precious and valuable possession? And I see a lot of husbands looking at their wives saying, is this a trick question? How do I answer this? Taking out people of the equation, what is your most precious and valuable possession? Think about it for just a moment. Get a picture of it in your mind. I have another question for you. What would your husband or wife say is your most precious and valuable possession? What would your children say is your most precious and valuable possession? Do you remember a few years ago there was a game show on TV that ran for a number of years? I just loved to watch it. It was called the Newlywed Gang. They had this show where they would ask these couples, they would separate them and ask them the same question. And they would record their answers. And it might be, what is your wife's favorite restaurant? And they may come back and ask the husband, he puts up Whataburger. And the wife comes out and she says, what's your favorite question? She holds up her card and says, Olive Garden. And he looks at her and says, you don't like Olive Garden. And she says, I hate Whataburger. The husband and wife have quite different perspectives, quite different answers to the same question. But the question I ask you, how would other people look at you and answer the question, what is his or hers most precious and valuable possession? That question comes up in our chapter today. If you would open your Bibles to Luke chapter 15. We're going to find out what is the most precious and valuable possession to Jesus. We're going to begin reading in Luke chapter 15, verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him. And the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he tells them this parable. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. Just so, I tell you, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Jesus is trying to teach the Pharisees and the scribes what the most precious possession to the Father and to the Son is. And he begins by telling them this story. What's the main point that Jesus is trying to make here? That we're all precious to him. Okay? Is he trying to say that the 99 are not important? No. Not at all. Does that mean that there's not any joy in heaven unless a sinner repents? There's no joy over the 90 and 9? Not at all. There's joy. But it's talking about the celebration when one returns that has been lost. One of the unique things about this passage that I thought is, we talk about how Jesus is talking about going after that one lost sheep. And sometimes we can perceive that God values that one lost soul, that he values that other person. But I'm not sure that he values me that much. Do we ever picture ourselves as being the one lost sheep? That Jesus would leave all the others behind to come and to seek us? How do we know that that can be a problem? I've talked to people before. I just don't know that God can forgive me. What is that saying? They're saying, I'm not that one lost sheep. I'm not valuable enough for Jesus to forgive me. I'm so bad that Jesus wouldn't go after me. But isn't that the point of this passage? Is that there is no one that is not so precious that Jesus wouldn't seek them and seek them fervently. And one of the important facets behind this story is the passion at which the seeking takes place. It says he leaves the 99 and goes after that one lost sheep. When my sons were 12 and 10, I decided to take off work one day and take them to the state fair. And so we went to the state fair, took them to all the educational exhibits, all the things that I wanted them to see and to learn. And then we went and bought some tickets. You know, everything out there, from the rides to the food and everything, you have to buy tickets for. I bought each of them some, I think, $10 worth of tickets, and said, okay, you can spend these any way you want, rides, games, food, souvenirs, whatever you want, but once you spend your money, we're going home. And my youngest son goes straight over to the booth where they guess your weight and your age. And I'm thinking, no. Okay. So he goes over and he's watching, and he's on my left side, my 12-year-old's on my right side, and we're watching, and somebody on my son's right side asked a question, and I look over there, and then when he's finished asking, I'm turned to my young son to see if he's going to do it or not, and he's gone. And I look around, and I asked my older son, I said, did you see where he went? And he said, no. And there was one of those policemen sitting up on a lifeguard tower right there, and I said, did you happen to see the little boy that was right here? And he said, no. And he said, can you see him? And he said, no, I don't see him. He said, but don't worry, we always find him within half an hour. Okay, so we start looking. I start looking around, and I leave my 12-year-old with the policeman there, and I go off looking for him. And I look and look and look all around there, and I run back to the ticket booth where we bought the tickets, and he wasn't there, and couldn't find him. I came back, and he said, well, maybe somebody took him down to the lost kid area. So he told me where it was, and I went down there. He wasn't there, but they said, oh, don't worry, we always find him within 30 minutes. And I said, well, it's already been about 20 minutes. And it's, we'll find him quickly. Well, to make a long story shorter, very long story, my son was missing for 10 hours. I called all of my friends, I called my family, I called everybody I knew, I called the church. We had people up there searching the state fairgrounds for my son. I had all kinds of horrible visions in my mind. I literally ran through that park. I don't know how many miles I put on, just constantly running from one exhibit to another, trying to find him. And finally, one of my friends found him. And back then we had pagers. We didn't have cell phones, and I got a page that to come back, and I went back, and he had found him. And he said he was just in one of the exhibits, just having a grand old time. He'd been gone 10 hours, and he still had $8 worth of his tickets left. And I asked him, so where have you been? He said, well, you said we could go spend our tickets any way we wanted to, so I went to do that. And I said, how were you going to get back to us? Well, I didn't think about that. Evidently. I understand this parable more than I ever would have without that story. I just can't tell you how earnestly I sought for my son. That is the same passion that Jesus is talking about pursuing this lamb, this lost sheep. One of the interesting things about sheep is sheep have no way to protect themselves, do they? They have no defensive mechanism. Their defensive mechanism is to freeze. They don't have the fight or flight instinct. They just freeze. And that makes them especially vulnerable to the lions and the bears and the wolves and the coyotes and everything. They cannot protect and care for themselves. Spiritually, we are the same way, are we not? We don't have the ability to save ourselves. We are totally dependent on someone else to save us. Another interesting thing in this story is, what did Jesus do when he found the sheep? What does it say he did? I'm sorry? He picked him up and laid him on his shoulders. You know, there are some times when we are so tired and weak that we can't carry ourselves. This is a story of how passionate, that in those times when our faith is weak, when our ability to go on seems so far removed from us, that Jesus can provide the strength for us. You've often seen this poem, Footsteps in the Sand, that where the gentleman talks about, where were you when I needed you? There's only one set of footprints. And he says, that's when I carried you. That's the illustration here, is that when there are times when we get lost, when we get in those darkest hours of our lives, that Jesus can pick us up and put us on his shoulders and carry us and take us back to the fold. And there was much rejoicing. Now, one of the things that we need to think about, this is not about percentages, is it? It's not about, Jesus just thinks the 1% is more important than the 90%. It's about the joy that happens every time a sinner repents, every time a sinner returns to God. William Barclay made this statement. He said, the joy in heaven over one sinner, talking about the scribes and the Pharisees, the joy in heaven over one sinner being obliterated by God is the way the Pharisees view it. Their joy is when a sinner is punished, when a sinner is obliterated, not when a sinner is restored. Jesus goes on to further illustrate this point in the parable of the lost coin. Or what woman, having 10 coins of silver, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, rejoice with me, for I found the coin that I had lost. Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Again, the same concept of how every single soul is precious to God and how you don't spare any effort. It says she swept the house, she cleaned up, she looked under the beds and under the tables and all the corners and all the cracks, looking diligently for the coin that was lost. The coin didn't have a lot of intrinsic value, and it was one of 10. She had a lot more money still there, but that one coin, even though it had small value, it had great rejoicing when it was found. I like one part about this. It says that when the coin was lost and she began to seek it, it says, if she loses it, doesn't she light a lamp? She shines the light. How many times have you driven by an airport at night and you don't see that light that's shining out into the darkness? What's the purpose of that light tower? to show the planes the way home, to show the way back to the airport to safety. The light also serves that when we have a lighthouse out in the ocean, what is the purpose of the lighthouse? To let the ships know where the shore is, to help them to avoid the danger. So when we're searching for the lost, it's important that we shine the light, that we show them the way home by showing them the light. Then we go on to the story of the lost son. There are so many lessons to be learned from this that I know that this is probably one of the most preached on, taught on, quoted on passages in the Bible is the story of the prodigal son, the story of the father who has a son approach him and the son says, "Give me all that is mine because I want to spend it my way. And so give me my inheritance. Even though I don't deserve it, I haven't earned it, I want it now. I don't want to wait." And so the father allows the son to receive his inheritance. And the son goes off and does what with it? He squanders it. And in what manner? Riotous living. Does that mean that he's had a lot of fights? Is that what riotous is? What does the riotous living mean?
Big party.
Parties, drunkenness, all kinds of wickedness is the description of the riotous living. So the son goes out and spends his money. And then we have the other character in our story, the brother. Does the brother go out and do the same? What does the brother do? He stays home, and later we're going to see that he quietly, but he stays home and he continues to work. He continues to serve the Father faithfully. One of the important points of this story that we see is when the son goes away and finds himself in trouble, and it says he comes to himself. Where had he been? It says he came to himself. What is the concept? Where was he that he wasn't with himself? Exactly. What was I thinking? Have you ever said that to yourself? After you done something, you say, what in the world was I thinking? A lot of people say, well, I wasn't in my right mind. The idea that we'd gone totally outside of ourselves. Isn't that true? Because when he comes to himself and he begins to realize his position, what he has done, and what he has done to himself and his sin, not only before God, but also his Father, he comes to himself and he comes to the point of repentance. One of the things that I think about, when we repent and we confess our sins and we return to God, don't we also come to ourselves? Because how were we created? We were created in the image of God. And when we take ourselves down into the pig pen of sin and we go out and we commit riotous living of whatever our own choosing is, we distort that image of God, don't we? That image of God becomes unrecognizable. When we're living in that kind of living and we call ourselves a Christian, how well does that Christian image shine? Do people look at us and say, there's a Christian, or do they see there's somebody just like me? And so our image becomes so distorted. And so I like it that when he came to himself, he realized he was not in the image that he was created. He was not in the image of a son that he was created in. He was in a fallen state. And so he goes to himself, talks to himself, and he says, I will go back to my father, and I will ask to be what? Forgiven, but I will ask to be put as what? Make me a servant. Make me a servant. I'm no longer worthy to be called a son. And so he noticed the change in attitude. What was his first request when he went to his father? Give me. Give me that's mine. Give me, give me, give me. Now what is he going to the father saying? Make me. Father, make me into something else. He is humbling himself. He's allowing the father to make him what the father wants. And the father, instead of making him a servant, restores him to the position of the sonship. One of the interesting things that I noted in this story is, let me go back and tell you this story. There was a husband and a wife. I may have told you this. If I did, you can buzz me. There was a man and woman driving down the road. They'd been married about 25 years at this point, and they were driving by, and they were stopped at a stoplight, and they looked over in the next car, and there was this young couple. They were teenagers, and they said you couldn't put a playing card between the two of them. They were sitting so close together. And the wife looked at her husband and says, do you remember when we were like that? Do you remember when we were just so close like that? And the man who was driving looked over and he said, I haven't moved. In this story, who moved? God or the Son? When we are apart from God, who moved? When somebody talks about, I feel so far away from God, who moved? God has always been there. God is always constant. If there's any distance between God and us, it's because we made the choice. We moved. And God didn't force the Son, or rather the Father didn't force the Son in this story. He didn't say, no, you're going to stay here and you're going to work. You're going to do exactly what I'm going to do, and you're going to like it. I remember my dad used to tell me sometimes when I would balk at eating liver on my plate, he said, you're going to eat it and you're going to like it. It didn't work very well, did it? I might have had to eat it, but I certainly didn't like it. God could force us to do His will, couldn't He? Absolutely. He could have made us mindless robots, but He gave us a mind. He gave us a free will. He gave us free choice to love Him or reject Him. And that's illustrated in this story when the Son chooses to reject the Father. But what do we learn about the Father? What do we know the Father did every single day? The Father looked for His Son. He was watching for Him. He was hoping for that day when He would see movement down the road. He was probably on the highest point of the house, don't you think? Where He could see the furthest. I remember a book back when I was a kid. The title of the book was called Will God Run? What do you think the answer is to that? Absolutely. God ran to the Son. When the Son repented, and it says while He was a long way off, the Father runs to Him and embraces Him and kisses Him. And picture the passion here. In all three of these stories, that's the main point that Jesus is trying to get across, is the passion that God has for seeking the lost, for finding the sinner, for restoring us, for bringing us back. When I told you the story about finding my son at the state fair, what do you think the first thing I did when I found my son was? I picked him up and I hugged him and squeezed him until he hollered and I had to put him back down. Then, what do you think the next thing was?
Why did you do that?
I'm going to kill you. That's the earthly side. Why did you do this to me? I was upset by how he had worried me and inconvenienced me. Is that the Father's? When we come back to the Father, does he sit there and say, why did you do this to me? Haven't I been anything but good to you? Haven't I given you everything? And explain yourself. Before I forgive you, you've got to give yourself a defense. But isn't what the Father does, is that he run and embrace us and rejoice over us? Then we move on to the story of the older brother. The older brother's out working, doing what he's supposed to do, and he hears the sound of celebration. And instead of going to find out what it is, what does he do? What does he do? Instead of going in and finding out what's going on, he chooses to send somebody else. I wonder why he did that. I wonder if he had a sneaking suspicion that this had happened. I wonder if he had thought, that there was a chance his brother might come home someday, because he sends somebody else in to find out what's going on, and he does. And he comes back and says, your brother has come home. Your father has killed the fatted calf. There's great celebration going on. And the brother refuses to come in. He stays outside. And it says the father goes out to him. When I was studying for this lesson, this is the first time this has ever made an impression on me. The father went to the younger son. The father pursued the older son. Did you ever think about that? The father pursued both his sons. Not only was his passion for seeking the younger son, his passion is for the older son too.
By this time, the son of the older one has become a lost son too, because he turned his back on him.
Yes. The older son becomes the lost son too. There is a sequel, or actually a prequel, I guess, to the story I told you about my son. I told you he was lost when he was 10 years old at the state fairgrounds. When I was 10 years old, I was a paper boy. Do y'all remember having paper boys? I was a paper boy for the Mid-Cities Daily News, and I won a trip to go to the Cowboy game. And they took all the winners to the Cowboy game one Sunday afternoon, and I was 10 years old, and they were playing the Saints. I still remember this. And the game was over, and I wanted to get a souvenir. I had a dollar or two, and we were proceeding out of the stadium, and I said, I want to buy a souvenir. And they said, no, come on, we just need to go home. Well, I thought I could run to the souvenir booth and get something, but I went over there and found out, how much do you think you can buy at a Cowboy game for $2? I couldn't find that, but I had to have something, so I finally got this little coin purse, and I didn't even want the coin purse, but it was the only thing I could buy for my $2. Well, I got it, and I looked up, and everybody was gone. I mean, all of the people I was with were gone. I thought, I know where the car is. So I proceeded out of the stadium, into the fairgrounds, and out into the streets of Dallas to find the car. Can you tell how this story goes? This was about 3:30 in the afternoon. My parents found me at midnight at a police station where I'd finally gone up to a policeman. I was crying, and they'd taken me to the police station. And oddly enough, they moved me from one police station to another, and my parents couldn't find me. Actually, the lady from the newspaper found me. My parents were still at the newspaper office waiting since 3 in the afternoon. I was lost, but I didn't know it. I thought I knew where I was going. I wasn't scared. I was going through the streets of Dallas. Isn't that like the older brother? He was just as lost as the other one, but didn't know it, didn't perceive it. And after my young son was found, my parents thought that was pretty funny, that I had gone through the same experience that I had put them through at exactly the same age. But the point is, you can be lost and not know it even while you're inside the church. Isn't that correct? With our hearts can be far from God and be lost and not know it. Now let's move on to chapter 16. And chapter 16, I think, is one of the hardest chapters in the Bible to understand, because it seems in this story of the unfaithful steward that Jesus is commending somebody that was unfaithful. It actually uses in the passage the word, the master commends him for what he's done. Let's read. He also said to the disciples, and notice here, he's teaching the disciples. He's not teaching the Pharisees and scribes and the others. He's talking to the disciples here. He said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called to him and said, what is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. And he said, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for he will love one and hate the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And so Jesus is telling this parable of what we call the unfaithful steward. It brings up the question, can you learn something good from a bad man? Is it possible to learn something good from a bad man? I think absolutely. We see many times in the Bible where we learn a good point from the experience of someone who was bad. What do we talk about the two men who built the houses? We call one the wise man and the foolish man. Do we learn something from the foolish man? Absolutely. We learn a good lesson for life from both the good examples and the bad. This servant was a slave. Many of you may remember that there were slaves of various types. A lot of times in America we have our image of slavery, of where they're in chains and out in the fields and working. But throughout the world, they had many different types of slaves. And do you remember the story of Joseph when he served in the house of Potiphar? His brothers had sold him as a slave, and that's what he was in the household of Potiphar. But he had risen to a position of trust, and he was given power and authority over all of Potiphar's household, save his wife. And so this is another example of a slave that had risen to a position of power. He was a manager, if you will, a CFO, chief financial officer, evidently, for this household, and perhaps even his businesses, because he had financial decision making. And so he was in charge of the master's accounts and debtors. And when he found out that his master was coming to give an account, he decides to do something. He says, I think this is interesting. He says, I cannot dig. What do you think he meant by that? I can't work out in the fields. I can't dig holes. I don't know if his master had a well digging business or what, but he looked at it and says, I don't want to do that type of labor. I don't have that ability. So what did he decide to do? What does it say he decided to do? Oh, it also says he's too ashamed to beg. Does that mean he's too proud? Shouldn't we really substitute that word? Instead of, I'm too ashamed to beg, I'm too proud to beg. It says that I decided what to do so that when I am put out of management, people may receive me into their houses. He's realizing that he's got to prepare for the future, doesn't he? Yeah, he's got to figure out what he's going to do. So he contacts all the debtors of his master, and he says, you owe me 100, let's knock it down to 50. You owe my master 100, let's knock it down to 80. What do you think he was doing by doing that? What was the purpose?
Trying to get goodwill from those people.
He was creating goodwill from those people. He was trying to make connections, isn't it? Isn't that what we do? In fact, isn't there a website called LinkedIn that people do that they make connections with people in the business world? They like to put out some relationships so that if something happens to your job, you've got some connections to maybe help you find your next job. Well, that's what this man is doing. He's trying to develop some relationships. It says, so that when my master puts me out, they'll receive me into their house. When I'm out of a job, they're going to take me in because they feel sorry for me. And don't they really owe me? He's trying to create some obligation to help him. But then it says the master commends him. Why did the master commend him? It says the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. This really gave me a problem when I'm looking at this. It sounds like he's being commended for doing something wrong, right? I think if we really look at it, what the master is commending him is doing him for one thing, realizing that what his state was. He realized that he was fixing to be fired, didn't he? He realized that he was going to have to give an account, that the master was going to come. Now, what could have happened when he found out the master was coming? What could he have done? What were his options? He could have done nothing, right? He could have just sat around and worried and fretted and said, oh, what am I going to do? There's nothing I can do. And then the master comes and he's totally unprepared. He could have run, couldn't he? Could he said, oh, the master's coming, I'm out of here, and just fled and just took his chances on whatever he did. But the fact is, he realized that he was going to have to give an account. Aren't we going to have to give an account? How easy is it for Christians to forget that those same words that this master said, it says in verse 2, and he called to him and said, what is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management. Isn't this words that we're all going to hear on the last day? Give an account of your management. Management of what? What have we been given? I'm sorry? Everything. As I sat down and looked at it, I kind of categorized it into 4 different areas. We've all been given time, right? We've all been given possessions. We've all been given talents. We've all been given influence. Isn't that true? Now, we all don't have the same amount of possessions, correct? We don't all have the same amount of talents, right? And we may not all have the same amount of influence. But doesn't every one of us have influence over somebody? Doesn't every one of us have 24 hours in a day? Doesn't every one of us here own something? The point of this story is not that I'm going to be judged by Randy's talents. I'm not going to be judged by how Ross uses his possessions or how Danny uses his influence. I'm going to be judged by how I use mine. And so that's why this unfaithful servant is being commended, is he realized judgment day is coming. But instead of running from it or just sitting around fretting, doing nothing, he tried to prepare for it. Now, granted, in a dishonest way, and the dishonesty is not what's being commended. What's being commended is the motivation to action. The recognition of judgment day is coming, and I've got to be ready. Now, where he did fall is he tried to save himself by figuring out a way to do it. But realizing I can't save myself. I can't dig. I'm too proud to beg. I need somebody else to save me. And so that's why he reaches out to all of these debtors. So Jesus is commending is that he realizes he can't save himself. He needs somebody out there that's going to be his salvation. We need somebody to be our salvation. We can't save ourselves. In our sinful state, we are totally lost without the cleansing blood of Jesus. How we use our possessions, how we use our money is going to be a determining factor in how we are judged in the final day. How we use our time. Now, granted, everybody doesn't have the same amount of time. My best friend was killed when we were 10 years old in an automobile accident. 8 months ago, I was in an automobile accident that could have taken my life. I was spared. Why? I don't know. But what I do know is I've been given time, and that weighs heavily. When I read this story, it weighs. I'm going to have to give an account. God said, I gave you extra time. What did you do with it? What did you do for me with what you have been given? Now, this is a heavy story, and a lot of times this story brings about, we use it to give guilt, don't we? A lot of times when churches are behind their budget, they'll pull out this story and say, how are you doing with your money? You're going to have to give an account for it. We need to meet our budget. And they'll put guilt on us. But is that the point of the whole point of the story is just to lay guilt? Or is the point of the story to say everything has meaning and purpose? There's purpose for your time. There's purpose for your influence. There's meaning to your possessions. There's a purpose for everything that you have. What you're going to be judged on is how well you serve that purpose and how much meaning you give to your life. Thank you.